In 1917-18, the soldiers on the Western Front had to endure one of the worst winters on record. Morale was low, the conditions were appalling. Intelligence reports suggested that the Germans were preparing a massive offensive before the Americans joined the war in large numbers. The Russian Revolution had meanwhile taken that country out of the war. Huddling in their miserable trenches, all the Otagos could do was wait.
I think it was our bleakest winter. By then we'd been on campaign since 1915 effectively. The disappointment, the disaster that was Passchendaele felt deeply through the division. And for the Otago battalion, they knew that discipline was at breaking point as well. But the French army had mutinied, as I say. The Russians were out of the war. America was in the war, but their troops were going to take quite some time to arrive in France.
That last bit with Polduc Chateau and so on was pretty awful. The whole of the Allied army almost broke down at that point. There were mutinies, particularly amongst the French, to a small extent amongst the Australians. That didn't happen with the New Zealanders, but I guess if you're looking for a low point of morale in the Otagos, as with the rest of the New Zealand army, that's it. I think the North Island troops found it harder in these conditions. The blokes from the south were, like you say, much more used to hard, wet conditions, and I guess they were used to damp conditions as well. But there was a level of dampness and a degree of mud that even Southlanders hadn't experienced. It was just that wee bit worse again. So although they did better than those from further north, it was still hard and it was still difficult. And we just can't underestimate, I don't think, those environmental issues. Some modern revisionists are trying to suggest that mud's been overdone because, of course, an awful lot of the main campaigns happened in summer. But the time we're talking about was the wettest, most horrible winter in 50 years. And it was extremely grim. And then add to that, all the shelling, the danger, the constant of killing of men all around you, loss of mates, all that sort of stuff. Put it all together, it's a very difficult time.
In the front lines, something had to give. Finally, in the early hours of March the 21st, 1918, the Germans launched Operation Mikhail, more commonly known as the Spring Offensive. This enormous assault allowed the Germans to smash through the British lines near the Somme and advance through open country towards the English Channel. Now, the Otagos were out of the line at that time and were training in the Armentières section as the Germans made their great breakthrough. They were hastily dispatched south with the rest of the New Zealand division down to the Somme to stem the flow of the German advance. It was an enormous logistical effort to bring the New Zealand division all the way from Flanders down here to the Somme, back near where they'd been in 1916, but this time they were going to fight their first ever defensive battle as the huge German campaign surged forward and a gap had opened up between the British and the French. It was over to the colonials, the New Zealanders and the Australians, to plug that gap and stop the German advance. The men were tired, they were hungry, they didn't have their gear, they had to sleep out in the fields, but it was urgent that they get cracking and move forward. The Germans had to be blocked. This was the gap that was open. The whole war hinged on it. It was backs to the wall time. So after concentrating here as best they could, the units all mixed up, composite battalions were formed and they were sent forward from here. The pressure was on. As soon as they were ready, these composite groupings marched off. Minimum of gear, no coats, no bags, just lots of ammunition. They moved here through this little town of Mele. The gunners set up here, started firing their guns. The rest of the Otagos went through to Collencamp and then on, forming this defensive screen between Haybuturn and Hamel. Across the road you can see the sign pointing to Ocean Villas. Ocean Villas is what they called it. Ingelbelmer, the strong defensive screen had to be set up to block the Germans. This was desperate stuff. They were on the march, didn't matter the conditions, didn't matter what they have, didn't matter who they were with. They had to stop the Germans coming through.
Again, it's an important one. The first thing, along with everybody else, is they had to be very fit, because they had to march 25 miles, 40 kilometres in full kit, carrying something like 70 pounds of weight, let's not forget that again. And then fight a rampaging army that was on a roll, that had all its own way, and was much better armed than they were, but they just dug in and, along with the other New Zealand units, and basically reversed the advance of this slightly overconfident and possibly sometimes drunk advancing German army, where you had hungry soldiers who suddenly discovered, food and grog for the first time in ages, and overindulged, and they weren't at their best, I think it's true to say. Whereas our guys were highly drilled by Russell by this stage. They've been prepared for such an eventuality down by the coast, and they did very well fighting around villages and houses and pubs and those sorts of places with great efficiencies, but basically using rifles and to a less extent machine guns to outmaneuver the Germans, who had a lot more artillery support than we did. But it went to show that artillery support alone wasn't going to win such fighting.
As the battle raged to the east of Collincomp and this other line of towns that the New Zealanders were moving forward from, the Germans shelled them heavily, the heaviest bombardments of the war that the New Zealanders experienced anyway. And in one of those bombardments, the headquarters of the New Zealand Rifle Brigade, the group that was actually leading the charge on the New Zealand front here, was hit directly. And Brigadier General Harry Fulton, a Dunedin boy, an Otago boys high school old boy, leader of the brigade, was killed. One of the highest ranking officers in the New Zealand Division to suffer that fate during the First World War. There was little time for rest. In their makeshift defences, the Otagos fought desperately in some of the bitterest fighting of the war. At the end of March 1918, the 2nd Otagos were camped out in these fields to the east of Collincomp, providing a defensive screen behind the New Zealand Rifle Brigade slightly further forward and at the cutting edge of the defence against the German advance. The New Zealanders had by now successfully established a line from Hamel over to my right through to Haybuturn over to the left there, and were defending that against everything the Germans could throw at it, and the Germans threw an awful lot. The conditions were pretty miserable for the men here, camped out in the fields. It rained, it was cold, rations were slow to get through, and they had to survive on what they could raid from the abandoned French farmhouses. But apparently the tucker there was pretty good, so despite the miserable conditions, the men ate like kings. And when the New Zealand Division reached Haybuturn here, they linked up with the Australians, and the Anzac screen was complete. The Germans were blocked. For the last time in the war, the Australians and the New Zealanders fought side by side, and for the first time it was a defensive battle they were engaged in, a defensive battle that they won.
And it was just that determination, that digging in at that critical moment, that was vital and literally stopped the Germans in their tracks.
With the defensive screen secure, eventually the great German advance ran out of puff. And then the New Zealanders began to push forward. They advanced on two sides against Rossignol Wood behind me. And this was the scene of some of the greatest exploits of Otago's superhero of the First World War, the redoubtable Sergeant Dick Travis, the king of no man's land. So here we are inside Rossignol Wood, regrown after being destroyed in the First World War, but with these various dips and bumps showing all the entrenchment that was made here by both sides during the attack and defence. Now the Germans in particular had created very strong positions in the wood, but they abandoned most of them when the New Zealanders surrounded them on two sides and pulled out of the wood. The New Zealanders then moved in and occupied Rossignol Wood. On the 24th of July 1918, the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Otago Regiment were tasked with clearing a trench system that came out of Rossignol Wood behind me, the Slug Trench, I can see it here on this old trench map, and then the Hawk Trench system just over the other side of the road beneath the power pylons. Now in that action, the efforts single-handedly of Sergeant Dick Travis were unbelievable. He sniped, he bayoneted, he bombed, and almost on his own, he took charge of the whole trench system. For that effort, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. It was one of the great feats of arms of a single person in the New Zealand Division during the war. Sadly, the next day, he was killed by a stray shell back in the Otago positions. This veteran of Gallipoli, this man from the Otago Mounted Rifles, who'd become the hero of the Otago Infantry Regiment on the Western Front. The sorrow that followed his loss was felt across the New Zealand Division. Here's the final resting place for Dick Travis. That wasn't even really his name. He was born Dixon Cornelius Savage in Taranaki, but things didn't go so well for him at home there, and he left Taranaki and moved to Southland, changed his name to Dick Travis, and joined up under that name with the Otago Mounted Rifles in 1940. He served at Gallipoli, but with the breakup of the Otago Mounted Rifles as a regiment, he transferred to Otago Infantry, and here on the Western Front he became a legend. The king of no man's land, the prince of scouts, the man who could go out into no man's land and bring you back a prisoner, who could take out a machine gun nest, who could do anything. His death was a signal tragedy for the regiment and for the division, and his funeral on the 26th of July 1918 stopped everything for the New Zealand Division. General Russell, commanding officer of the division, spoke at his funeral. So did the brigade commanders. And men who had seen death and destruction every day and who had lost many of his mates wept for the passing of this man who was such an inspiration for the Otagos, for the New Zealanders, a legend in his own time. The tide had turned, and the Otagos managed to advance towards the Germans, who were exhausted as well. They didn't know it at the time, but plugging the gap in the German spring breakthrough would be one of their most important actions of the entire war.
Oh, arguably the most important, and yet this was never acknowledged here until an awful lot later. I mean, it was actually Paul Enright in a book that I did with him for school kids called Milestones that dug this all out of the Army record, and then Glenn Harper went on and wrote a full book about it a few years after that. And up until then, this is a story that wasn't much told. Not quite sure why, it just got lost somehow or another. And yet it's hugely important, and it was, along with the Australians a bit further south at Amiens, this was a critical moment in the war, because if the Germans hadn't been held up at that point, they might have made it through the British Channel. History of the war would have been quite different. So the fact that we, along with some British and French units, did so well is critical.
I mean, the thing was, it's worth remembering that the British Army, who from March into April bore the brunt of the serious assault, when the Germans pushed them back 64 kilometres, that was the British Army that blunted the German assault. Then the fresh troops, the Australians, New Zealanders, came in and pushed them back, pushed the Germans back effectively to their start line. In some ways helped turn the tide from the great German assault that was going to split the British and French forces and conclude the war once and for all, to the slow and agonising German defeat in the field.
As such an important wartime feat of the New Zealanders, are their desperate actions around the Somme in 1918 remembered?
Yeah, it's starting to be acknowledged now, but it took a while. It wasn't, we just sort of got mentioned in dispatches kind of thing until not so long ago, but I think most of the more recent work is starting to acknowledge the fact that the New Zealanders did play a key role.
And so the Otagos, along with the other New Zealand battalions, halted the last great German chance to win the war. With conscripts replenishing their ranks from home, the units were charging up, ready for the grand finale of World War I.